Sometimes the biggest lie you ever tell becomes the only way to discover the truth. That was the thought that kept replaying in my mind as Logan Parker wrapped one steady arm around my shoulders and looked directly into my ex-boyfriend's eyes. "He came with me," Logan said calmly, his voice confident enough to silence the awkward conversation surrounding us. For one endless second, nobody at my sister's engagement party spoke. My ex, Andrew Collins, stared at us in complete surprise. My sister Rachel blinked twice before the biggest smile spread across her face. Friends and relatives exchanged curious glances, already accepting the story before I had even managed to understand what had just happened. Logan's hand remained gently against my back, warm enough to remind me that this was supposed to be an act. The strange part was that nothing about it felt fake. Earlier that same morning, everything had seemed much simpler. I had every intention of inventing a last-minute excuse to avoid the engagement party altogether. Rachel had been planning the celebration for months, and I genuinely wanted to support her. But there was one problem I could not ignore. Andrew had confirmed he would be attending with the man he had started dating shortly after we broke up. I told myself I had moved on, but knowing I would have to smile politely while pretending nothing hurt felt exhausting before the day had even begun. I stood in my apartment staring at the invitation on the kitchen counter when someone knocked on the door exactly 3 times. I did not even have to ask who it was. "You have been ignoring my messages for an hour," Logan called from the hallway. "That usually means you are making a terrible decision." I opened the door and forced a smile. Logan looked at me for less than 2 seconds before crossing his arms. "You were about to cancel." "I was considering it." "No," he corrected with a laugh. "You already decided. You were just looking for a reason to feel less guilty about it." That was the frustrating thing about having Logan as my best friend. After 8 years of friendship, he could read me almost as easily as I could read myself. He walked into my apartment, picked up the invitation from the counter, and placed it back in my hand. "Your sister wants you there. Andrew will be there." Logan nodded. "I know. With his boyfriend." "I know that too." I sighed and leaned against the kitchen counter. "I am not afraid of seeing him." Logan raised one eyebrow. "Then what are you afraid of?" I looked down at the invitation before answering honestly. "I am afraid everyone will look at me and quietly wonder why I am the only one who never figured things out." Logan's expression softened immediately. "Tyler, nobody who loves you is thinking that." I laughed quietly. "Easy for you to say." "Why?" "Because you have your life together." Logan shook his head with an amused smile. "You really think that?" He reached for my coffee mug, took one sip without asking, and made the same face he always made whenever I accidentally added too much sugar. "For the record," he said, "your coffee is still terrible." I laughed despite myself. "You still drank it." "Because you made it." The room grew comfortably quiet for a moment. Logan looked toward the bedroom where the suit I had planned to wear still hung untouched on the closet door. "Go get ready," he said. "I am driving." "Logan, no arguments. You do realize this could become awkward." He smiled with complete confidence. "Then we will survive the awkward part together." At the time, I believed he was only promising to stand beside me while I faced an uncomfortable evening. I had no idea that before the sun set, one unexpected sentence, one convincing smile, and one impossible lie would change the way both of us looked at each other forever. The drive to my sister's engagement party should have taken 20 minutes. But somehow every traffic light seemed determined to give me extra time to overthink everything waiting at the other end of the trip. Logan drove with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel while soft music played through the speakers. Every now and then he glanced toward me, probably noticing that I had barely said 10 words since leaving my apartment. Finally, he reached over and lightly tapped the invitation still sitting in my lap. "You are wearing a hole through that piece of paper." I looked down and realized I had been folding the corner over and over without noticing. "Sorry." Logan smiled. "You do not have to apologize for being nervous." "I am not nervous." "Tyler." I sighed. "Fine. Maybe a little." He laughed quietly. "That is already an improvement. At least now you are telling the truth." We pulled into the parking lot outside the country club where Rachel's celebration was being held. Elegant string lights stretched across the entrance, and laughter drifted outside each time the doors opened. Before either of us stepped out of the car, Logan turned off the engine and looked at me with unexpected seriousness. "Before we go inside, we need a plan." I frowned. "A plan? If Andrew starts asking questions, or anyone assumes something that makes you uncomfortable, I will handle it. Logan, you do not have to protect me. I know. He smiled gently. I want to. Those 4 simple words stayed with me as we walked toward the entrance together. Inside, the ballroom glowed with warm lights reflecting off white flowers and polished glass. Rachel spotted us almost immediately and hurried over with a bright smile before wrapping me in a hug. You actually came. I told you I would try. She laughed, which usually means no. Then she turned toward Logan. Thank you for dragging my stubborn little brother here. Logan grinned. It was a team effort. The 3 of us talked comfortably until Rachel was called away to greet more guests. For the next half hour, everything felt surprisingly normal. Logan kept finding reasons to make me laugh, introducing me to distant relatives I barely remembered, and somehow making every awkward conversation feel easy. Then I saw Andrew across the room. He was speaking with another couple near the dessert table. For just a second our eyes met before he politely smiled and started walking toward us. My heartbeat immediately became louder than the music. Logan noticed without me saying a word. Breathe, he murmured quietly. You are doing fine. Andrew stopped a few feet away. Tyler, it has been a while. It has. We exchanged the kind of careful small talk that belongs between 2 people who once knew everything about each other and now knew almost nothing. Before the conversation could become even more uncomfortable, Rachel suddenly returned carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She looked at both of us before smiling curiously. I have been meaning to ask you something all evening. I immediately knew I was not going to like whatever came next. What is it? Rachel's eyes moved from me to Logan and back again. So, Tyler, are you finally dating someone? I opened my mouth, searching desperately for a harmless answer, but no words arrived. The silence lasted barely 2 seconds before Logan calmly stepped closer beside me. His shoulder lightly brushed mine as though the movement were the most natural thing in the world. Actually, he said with an easy smile, he is. Rachel's eyes widened with excitement. Really? I turned toward Logan in complete disbelief, but his expression remained perfectly relaxed. Then, before I could stop him, he looked directly at everyone standing nearby and added the sentence that changed the entire evening. He is dating me. For one breathtaking moment, the room seemed to stand perfectly still, and before I could deny the impossible story, Rachel threw her arms around both of us with tears of happiness already shining in her eyes, while every smiling face around us accepted the lie as though it had always been the truth. My brain completely stopped working. Rachel was still hugging both of us while relatives gathered around with warm congratulations, and Logan somehow accepted every smile, every handshake, and every excited question without showing the slightest hint of panic. I, on the other hand, could barely remember how to breathe. This is wonderful, my aunt said with genuine excitement. How long have you 2 been together? Before I could accidentally destroy the story in its very first minute, Logan answered with calm confidence. Almost 6 months. I turned toward him in disbelief, but he never looked at me. Instead, he smiled naturally as though we had rehearsed every detail for weeks. 6 months. Rachel repeated happily. Why did neither of you tell me? Logan glanced at me before, giving a playful shrug. Tyler wanted to be sure this relationship was real before telling everyone. Rachel immediately reached for my hand. That sounds exactly like something my brother would do. I forced a nervous laugh, while silently wondering how Logan had managed to invent an answer that sounded more believable than anything I could have said. The conversation continued as more relatives joined us. Everyone seemed delighted by the unexpected news. One uncle asked where we had gone on our first date. Before I could answer, Logan smiled. A little coffee shop near Riverside Park. I blinked. That was the same place we had gone almost every Saturday morning for years. It had never been a date, but somehow the answer felt strangely true. Another cousin asked who confessed first. Logan laughed softly. Neither of us really planned it. We just kept spending more time together until one day we realized we already acted like a couple. Everyone around us smiled at the story, and I noticed something unsettling. Logan was not inventing random details. He was quietly reshaping real memories into something that sounded romantic. Every answer came from moments we had genuinely shared. Coffee on Saturday mornings, weekend farmers markets, movie marathons during rainy evenings, helping each other move apartments, celebrating birthdays together. None of those memories had been fake. Only the label had changed. Rachel eventually hurried away to greet more guests, leaving the two of us standing beside the refreshment table. The moment nobody else could hear us, I leaned closer. "What are you doing?" I whispered. Logan calmly picked up 2 glasses of sparkling cider before handing one to me. "Keeping your sister happy. You just told my entire family we have been dating for 6 months. Technically, I said almost 6. That is not helping." He smiled, trying not to laugh. "Relax. Relax." I looked around the ballroom, where several relatives were already smiling at us from across the room. "They all believe you." Logan finally looked directly into my eyes. "Then maybe we should make it easy for them to keep believing." I stared at him, completely confused. "You cannot be serious." "I am serious about getting you through tonight." His expression softened. "You were terrified of seeing Andrew. Now nobody is looking at your past. They are looking at your future." Before I could answer, Rachel's father-in-law stepped over with another cheerful question. "Logan, you seem to know Tyler incredibly well. Tell me something about him that nobody else notices." Logan did not hesitate for even a second. Whenever Tyler gets anxious, he quietly twists the sleeve of whatever shirt he is wearing. He has been doing it since college, usually without realizing it. Instinctively, I looked down. My fingers were already twisting the cuff of my jacket exactly the way he described. The older man smiled warmly before walking away, impressed by Logan's answer. I remained frozen where I stood. "How did you notice that?" I asked quietly. Logan looked almost surprised by the question. "Because I notice everything about you." He answered so naturally that I doubted he even realized how deeply those words reached me. And for the first time since the impossible lie began, I started wondering whether the hardest part of the evening would not be pretending to be his boyfriend, but pretending those simple words had not changed something inside my heart. The words echoed through my mind long after Logan said them. "Because I notice everything about you." He had spoken so casually that anyone standing nearby would have assumed it was simply another convincing detail supporting our imaginary relationship. Yet I could not stop wondering how many tiny pieces of my life he had quietly memorized without ever mentioning them. Before I had time to think any further, Rachel appeared beside us with an excited smile. "Perfect," she said. "Everyone is moving into the ballroom for dinner. Couples are sitting together, so I saved 2 seats for you." Logan answered before I could protest. "Thank you." He rested one gentle hand against the middle of my back as we followed the other guests toward the beautifully decorated reception hall. The simple gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it felt surprisingly natural. We had walked beside each other thousands of times over the years. Yet tonight, every familiar movement seemed to carry a meaning neither of us had ever acknowledged before. During dinner, the questions continued. My grandparents wanted to know how we balanced busy work schedules. My cousins laughed while asking which one of us was usually late. Logan answered each question with effortless confidence. "Tyler always says he only needs 5 more minutes," he joked with an amused smile. "It usually becomes 15. Everyone laughed, including me, because it was true. Later, someone asked who remembered birthdays better. Logan immediately pointed toward me. He never forgets anyone's birthday, but he almost always forgets where he leaves his car keys. I looked at him in disbelief. "You remember that too?" Logan grinned. "Last month you called me because your keys were in the refrigerator." My face immediately grew warm as the entire table burst into laughter. "That happened one time," I protested. "Twice," Logan corrected gently. "The first time was during the apartment move." He was right. Every single memory he mentioned was real. Nothing sounded exaggerated. Nothing sounded rehearsed. He simply knew me better than anyone else sitting in that room. Even Rachel looked at us with quiet admiration before saying, "I have never seen Tyler this comfortable with anyone." Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. Comfortable. That had always been the perfect description of my friendship with Logan. There had never been awkward silence, forced conversations, or uncertainty about whether the other person would show up when life became difficult. He had always been there. The only difference tonight was that everyone else had started calling that connection something entirely different. After dinner, guests slowly gathered around the dance floor while soft music filled the ballroom. Couples began stepping onto the polished wooden floor one after another. Rachel walked over carrying an excited expression that instantly made me nervous. "There is one tradition you cannot skip," she announced. I already knew where this was going. "Rachel," she smiled innocently. Every couple has to dance at least one song. I looked toward Logan, silently, hoping he would rescue me with some believable excuse. Instead, he met my eyes with a calm expression and quietly asked, "Do you trust me?" I hesitated only a second before nodding. "Yes." He extended his hand toward me. "Then come dance with me." I placed my hand in his, reminding myself that this was still part of the act. Nothing more. Yet the moment we stepped onto the dance floor surrounded by smiling families and glowing lights, I realized the greatest danger was no longer convincing everyone else that we belonged together. The greatest danger was how effortlessly my heart had already started believing the story we were pretending to tell. The first notes of the slow song drifted through the ballroom as Logan gently guided me onto the dance floor. Around us, dozens of couples smiled, laughed, and swayed beneath warm string lights hanging from the ceiling. Everything about the moment should have felt ordinary, yet my heartbeat refused to settle. Logan placed one hand lightly against my shoulder while our other hands met naturally between us. He left enough space for both of us to feel comfortable, respecting the invisible boundary we had never discussed but had somehow always understood. "You look like you are preparing for a final exam," he whispered with an amused smile. I laughed despite myself. "I feel like I forgot to study." "Good," he replied. "That means you will stop thinking and just follow." The music carried us into slow, easy steps. Logan had always been a better dancer than I was. Years earlier, he had convinced me to attend beginner lessons before one of our co-workers' weddings because he claimed nobody should spend an entire reception hiding near the dessert table. Back then, I had stepped on his shoes more times than I could count. Tonight, however, everything felt strangely effortless. "You have improved," Logan said quietly. "Only because you keep leading." "Maybe," he smiled gently, "or maybe because you finally trust me." I looked into his eyes for a brief moment before looking away again. Trust had never been the difficult part. Somewhere nearby, Rachel clapped excitedly while encouraging everyone to move closer to the center of the dance. For photographs, guests surrounded us from every direction, making it impossible to create more distance even if we wanted to. Logan leaned slightly closer so I could hear him over the music. "Remember the rules?" he asked softly. I blinked in surprise. Earlier in the car, after deciding to continue the unexpected story, we had quietly agreed on 3 simple rules. First, never tell personal lies that could hurt someone later. Second, never act like a couple when nobody else was watching. Third, never let one evening change our friendship. "I remember," I answered. Logan nodded. "We are still following them." I wanted to believe that. Yet the longer we stood there surrounded by smiling relatives, the more those rules felt fragile. Rachel's photographer approached and cheerfully asked every couple to look at each other instead of the camera. Logan immediately turned toward me. "Pretend you actually like me," he joked. I smiled before realizing the problem with his request. Pretending had become far more difficult than expected because somewhere between dinner and this dance I had stopped separating the performance from reality. The photographer counted down before capturing several pictures. Everyone applauded, and the music slowly faded into another song. Just as I thought the most difficult moment was over, Andrew appeared beside the edge of the dance floor. He waited politely until the music ended before offering me a careful smile. "Tyler," he said, "would you mind if we talked for a minute?" Before I could answer, I noticed Logan's relaxed expression disappear for the first time all evening. He remained perfectly polite, but his eyes followed Andrew with a quiet intensity one had never seen before. Andrew looked between us. Just a short conversation. I hesitated, unsure what the right decision was. Logan did not interrupt. He simply looked at me and said one calm sentence that somehow carried more emotion than anything else he had spoken that evening. "It is your choice." Those 3 words should have made the decision easier, but instead they revealed something unexpected. For the first time since this impossible evening had begun, I realized I cared. Far more about disappointing the man standing beside me than about reopening a conversation with the man who had once walked away from me. And that quiet realization frightened me more than any lie we had told together. Andrew waited patiently while the music faded into quiet applause around us. His expression was calm, almost hesitant, nothing like the confident man I remembered from years ago. I glanced toward Logan. He did not step between us or offer another opinion. He simply gave a small nod that reminded me the decision belonged entirely to me. I took a slow breath before answering. A few minutes is fine. Andrew smiled politely. Thank you. We walked together toward the outdoor terrace overlooking the gardens behind the reception hall. Evening had settled across the property, and hundreds of small string lights hung above neatly trimmed hedges, casting a warm glow across the stone pathway. The sounds of laughter and music drifted softly through the open doors behind us, creating just enough distance for a private conversation without completely leaving the celebration. Andrew rested both hands in his pockets before speaking. First, congratulations. I almost laughed. For what? He looked back toward the ballroom where Logan was still talking comfortably with my family. You look happy. His answer caught me off guard. That surprises you. A little, he admitted honestly. Not because I wanted anything bad for you. I just did not expect to see you move on so completely. I nodded slowly. Life keeps moving. Andrew looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. I never apologized the way I should have. I remained quiet. When we ended things, he continued, I convinced myself we wanted different futures. Maybe we did. But I handled everything poorly, and I regret that. His voice carried genuine sincerity, and for the first time I realized I no longer felt the anger I had carried for so long. Time had quietly replaced it with perspective. Thank you, I answered. That means more than you probably realize. Andrew smiled with visible relief. Can I ask you something? Sure. He looked toward the ballroom once more. When did you and Logan become more than friends? I instinctively looked through the windows where Logan stood laughing with my grandfather. Not very long ago, I replied carefully. Technically that was true, at least according to the story everyone believed. Andrew chuckled softly. I guess I should have seen it sooner. I frowned. Seen what? The way he always looked at you. My heartbeat stumbled. What do you mean? Andrew shrugged gently. Whenever we all spent time together back then, Logan never seemed interested in controlling conversations or being the center of attention. He mostly watched to make sure you were comfortable. I stared at him without speaking. I honestly assumed the two of you would eventually figure it out. He smiled kindly. Looks like I was right. Before I could respond, movement inside the ballroom caught my attention. Logan had stepped closer to the terrace doors. He was not interrupting us or signaling for me to return. He simply stood there holding 2 fresh glasses of sparkling cider, waiting patiently while pretending to admire the garden decorations. He had probably been standing there for several minutes, making sure I knew he was nearby without placing any pressure on me. Andrew noticed him too. He really cares about you. I followed Logan with my eyes as he quietly thanked a passing waiter before remaining exactly where he was. Yes, I answered almost automatically. Andrew smiled one final time. Then do yourself a favor. What is that? Do not spend years wondering about someone who is already standing beside you. We shook hands warmly before walking back toward the ballroom together. As I reached the entrance, Logan immediately offered me one of the glasses he had been holding. Everything okay? He asked softly. I accepted the drink and nodded. Yes. Then I looked at him a little longer than usual, suddenly hearing Andrew's words echo inside my mind. Because the person who had quietly stood beside me through every difficult chapter of my life had never once asked for anything in return, and for the first time I began to wonder whether the confession I had been waiting to hear all evening was not Andrew's apology, but the truth. Logan was still trying so hard to hide. The celebration continued late into the evening, but something inside me had quietly shifted. Andrew's words refused to leave my mind, and every time I looked toward Logan, I noticed another small detail that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. The way he always made sure I had something to drink before asking if he wanted one himself. The way he remembered every relative's name after meeting them only once. The way he instinctively stepped closer whenever the room became crowded, creating space without making it obvious. None of those things had appeared overnight. They had been part of our friendship for years. I had simply never stopped to ask myself why one person would care so consistently for someone who was supposed to be only a friend. As the evening slowly drew to a close, guests began saying their goodbyes. Rachel hugged both of us once again before laughing. You two should come over for dinner next weekend. I want to hear the entire story about how this relationship started. Logan answered with the same calm confidence that had carried us through the entire evening. We would love that. Rachel smiled happily before disappearing into another conversation. I turned toward Logan the moment she was gone. You just accepted another invitation. He rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed smile. I know. Now what? He chuckled quietly. We survive one dinner at a time. We walked together toward the parking lot beneath a clear night sky, filled with bright stars. Cool autumn air replaced the warmth of the ballroom, and for several minutes neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, but it also carried dozens of unanswered questions. Halfway across the parking lot, Logan suddenly stopped walking. "Can we sit somewhere for a minute?" he asked softly. I looked toward a small wooden bench facing a peaceful garden lit by hanging lanterns. Sure. We sat side by side, listening to distant music drifting from the reception hall. Logan leaned forward with his hands loosely folded together, staring at the stone pathway beneath our feet. I had known him long enough to recognize that posture. It meant something important was weighing on his mind. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I need to tell you something." My heart immediately began racing again. "Okay." He let out a slow breath. "When Andrew asked if he could talk to you," he hesitated before quietly continuing. "I hated it." I looked at him in surprise. "Why?" Logan smiled without looking at me. "I kept telling myself it was because I did not want you getting hurt again." Another brief silence followed. But that was not the whole truth. I waited patiently. He closed his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "Watching him walk away with you bothered me more than it should have." My pulse became impossibly loud. "Logan." He shook his head before I could continue. "I know how that sounds." He forced a small laugh that carried almost no humor. "Maybe I just got too invested in pretending tonight." I studied his face carefully. He still refused to look directly at me. "Do you really believe that?" I asked quietly. Logan finally turned toward me. For just a second, the confident smile he had worn all evening completely disappeared, replaced by an honesty I had never seen before. He opened his mouth as though he were about to say something far more important. The words almost reached the surface. Then he stopped himself. His shoulders relaxed, and the familiar, easy smile returned. "Forget it," he said gently. "We probably stayed in character longer than we should have." I remembered the second rule we had created before entering the party. Never act like a couple when nobody else was watching. We were completely alone now, yet every caring gesture, every protective instinct, and every quiet look between us had continued exactly the same. I stared at him, suddenly realizing that the rule had already been broken long before either of us noticed. Logan stood and offered me his hand with an easy smile. "Come on, I should drive you home." I accepted his hand, but instead of immediately letting go, I held it for one extra heartbeat, silently wondering whether the greatest lie of the evening was not the story we had told everyone else, but the one Logan kept trying to convince himself to believe. The drive home was quieter than any ride Logan and I had shared in years. Usually we filled every mile with ridiculous jokes, conversations about work, or debates over which local pizza place deserved another chance. Tonight the silence was different. It was not uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of everything neither of us had found the courage to say. Logan pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment just before midnight. He turned off the engine and smiled the familiar easy smile I had known for years. "Well," he said lightly, "I guess we survived." I laughed softly. "Barely. Your family definitely believes we are together. That is because you deserve an award for acting." He looked down at the steering wheel for a brief moment before answering. "Maybe." I waited, expecting him to continue, but he simply reached into the back seat and handed me the suit jacket I had taken off during the reception. "Do not forget this." I accepted it without moving toward the door. "Logan." "Yeah. Thank you." He looked genuinely confused. "For what?" "For today. For standing beside me." His smile became warmer. "You never have to thank me for that." I stepped out of the car and watched him drive away, convinced that tomorrow we would laugh about the entire evening over coffee like we always did. Instead, the next morning felt strangely unfamiliar. My phone remained silent until almost noon, when a single message finally appeared from Logan. "Hope you got some sleep. Meeting ran long this morning. Talk later." That was all. No joke. No funny picture. No suggestion that we meet for lunch. I replied almost immediately, but his next answer did not arrive until hours later. Over the following week, the pattern continued. Every conversation became shorter. Every invitation was postponed because he was busy. We still spoke politely, but the effortless rhythm we had shared for years slowly disappeared. I told myself I was imagining things until Friday evening when I stopped by his apartment to return a book I had borrowed months earlier. Logan opened the door wearing comfortable clothes instead of his usual work jacket, looking genuinely surprised to see me. "Hey," he said with an awkward smile. "I was just about to make dinner." I held up the book. I figured I should finally give this back. "Thanks." An uncomfortable silence settled between us. Normally, I would have walked inside without asking. His apartment had always felt almost as familiar as my own. This time, neither of us moved. Finally, Logan spoke. "I should probably tell your sister that we decided to keep things private for a while." I frowned. "What?" He rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "About us." The word "us" sounded strangely distant now. "Eventually people will stop asking questions." I stared at him, trying to understand what had changed. "So that is it." He blinked. "What do you mean? We just go back to normal?" Logan forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "That was always the plan." The sentence landed harder than I expected. I remembered the 3 rules we had created before the engagement party. We had broken the second one without even realizing it. Now Logan was desperately trying to restore the third. Never let one evening change our friendship. I nodded slowly. "Right. Back to normal." He seemed relieved that I had not argued. We exchanged a few more polite sentences before I walked back toward my car. Halfway across the parking lot I stopped and looked back. Logan was still standing in his doorway watching me leave. The moment our eyes met, he smiled again and lifted one hand in a casual goodbye before quietly closing the door. I drove home with the strange realization that pretending to be his boyfriend for one evening had never been the difficult part. The truly impossible part was pretending I still wanted to be only his best friend after discovering what it felt like when the world believed we belonged together. The weekend arrived with a quiet rain that painted the city in soft shades of gray, matching the mood I had been carrying since the engagement party. Logan and I had spoken only through brief messages during the past several days, and every conversation ended before either of us said anything that actually mattered. I finally admitted to myself that waiting for things to magically return to normal was impossible because normal no longer existed. That Saturday afternoon, I found myself standing outside the small coffee shop near Riverside Park, the same place Logan had casually called our first date when we were inventing a relationship for my family. At the time, it had been another harmless detail in a convincing story. Now it felt like the only place where I could stop pretending I was fine. I sent him a simple message. "Can we meet here?" A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. "I am 10 minutes away." When Logan walked through the door carrying a damp umbrella and wearing his familiar navy jacket, he smiled politely, but I immediately recognized the careful distance he had been trying to maintain all week. He ordered his usual black coffee before sitting across from me. For several moments, we simply watched the rain slide down the windows. Finally, he broke the silence. "You sounded serious." I nodded. "Because I am." Logan leaned back slightly, waiting. "I do not want to keep pretending everything is normal." His expression became thoughtful. "Tyler," I gently interrupted him. "Please let me finish." He nodded. I took a slow breath, trying to organize feelings that had grown louder every day since the engagement party. "When you told everyone we were together, I thought the difficult part would be acting like your boyfriend." I smiled faintly. I was wrong. Logan remained completely silent. The difficult part started after it ended. I looked directly at him. "I keep waiting for our friendship to feel the way it did before, and it never does." He lowered his eyes to his coffee cup. "I know." Those 2 quiet words gave me the courage to continue. "I miss talking to you the way we always have. I miss laughing without thinking about every sentence. I miss believing that I understood what you were feeling." Logan slowly rubbed one hand across the side of his coffee cup before speaking. "I started avoiding you because I thought it was the only way to fix this." "Fix what?" He let out a long breath and finally looked at me. "Myself." I frowned in confusion. Logan smiled sadly. "The night of Rachel's party, I realized something I had spent years trying not to admit." My heartbeat immediately quickened. Every time someone congratulated us, I should have felt guilty because we were lying. He paused briefly. Instead, I kept wishing it was true. The sounds inside the coffee shop faded into the background as I stared at him. Logan continued quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "That was why I pulled away afterward. I thought if I created enough distance, those feelings would disappear and we could go back to being the friends you deserved." I shook my head almost instinctively. "You never had to earn that place in my life." Logan laughed softly. "Maybe not, but I was terrified that telling you the truth would cost me everything. I reached across the table before I could second-guess myself and rested my hand gently over his. Logan, the only thing that scared me was believing you wanted to forget that night. He looked at our hands for a long moment before slowly meeting my eyes again. For the first time since this impossible story had begun, neither of us was hiding behind a performance, protecting the other with half-finished sentences, or pretending our hearts had not already crossed the line we once promised never to approach. And in that quiet little coffee shop where our imaginary first date had been invented, we both realized the only thing left to do was finally stop pretending altogether. Logan did not pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers slowly closed around mine with a quiet certainty that seemed to erase every uncomfortable silence we had endured during the past week. Neither of us rushed to say another word. For years we had filled every conversation with jokes, stories, and easy laughter, but somehow this peaceful silence felt more honest than anything we had ever spoken. The rain continued tapping softly against the coffee shop windows while the afternoon crowd came and went around us without paying any attention. Logan smiled first. I spent the entire week trying to convince myself that one evening could not possibly change 8 years of friendship. I laughed quietly. How did that work out? He shook his head with a warm, almost embarrassed smile. Terribly. I finally relaxed for what felt like the first time since. Rachel's engagement party. Me too. Logan leaned back in his chair, still smiling. Do you remember the 3 rules we made before walking into the party? Every single one. We broke all of them. I nodded. The first one was never to tell personal lies. Logan laughed softly. Then I told your family I knew your favorite coffee shop because it was our first date, which accidentally became true today. Exactly. I continued with the second rule. Never act like a couple when nobody was watching. Logan raised one eyebrow. That one lasted about 30 minutes. I smiled as memories returned one after another. The quiet conversations, the careful gestures, the way he had waited outside while I talked with Andrew even though nobody expected him to stay. You kept taking care of me even after we were alone, I said. Logan lowered his eyes briefly. I forgot we were pretending. His honest admission made my heart feel lighter instead of heavier. The third rule, I said quietly, was never to let one evening change our friendship. Logan nodded once before meeting my eyes again. That was the biggest mistake we made. Because it changed everything? He answered without hesitation. Because the feelings were already there. That evening only forced us to stop hiding from them. His words settled gently between us. I realized he was right. Nothing truly new had appeared at the engagement party. The trust had already existed. The loyalty had always been there. The habit of choosing each other first had quietly become part of our lives long before either of us recognized it for what it was. We had mistaken years of quiet devotion for ordinary friendship simply because neither of us had been brave enough to ask a different question. Logan reached into his jacket pocket and smiled as he pulled out a folded photograph. Rachel texted me this morning. He handed it across the table. It was one of the pictures taken during the slow dance. We were looking at each other instead of the camera, smiling in a way neither of us had noticed at the time. She said it was her favorite picture from the party, Logan explained. I studied the photograph for several seconds before laughing softly. We really do look happy. Logan answered so quietly I almost missed it. Because I was. I looked back up. I was too. The honesty between us no longer felt frightening. It felt like coming home after taking the longest possible route. Logan smiled with a mixture of relief and hope. Can I ask you something? Of course. If we stopped pretending today, he said carefully, what would you want tomorrow to look like? I thought about the question only briefly because somewhere deep inside I had already known the answer. Exactly like before, I replied with a smile. Except this time we tell the truth. Logan laughed with genuine happiness, the familiar laugh I had missed all week. Then how about we start with something simple? What do you have in mind? He stood, picked up our empty coffee cups, and looked back at me with the same warm confidence that had first carried us through an impossible evening. A real first date, he said. No audience. No pretending. No rules. Just you and me. I stood beside him, smiling so naturally that nothing needed to be rehearsed anymore, because for the first time since our story had begun, every step we were about to take belonged completely to us. Our first real date happened exactly 1 week later, and the funniest part was realizing almost nothing about the day looked different from what we had done together for years. Logan still arrived 5 minutes early because he hated making anyone wait. I still walked out of my apartment carrying the wrong jacket because I had checked the weather too quickly. He still laughed before handing me the umbrella he had brought just in case. Some things never change, I said as we started walking toward Riverside Park. Good, Logan replied with a smile. I like most of those things. The afternoon sun reflected across the river while families, runners, and people walking their dogs filled the park with quiet energy. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, yet every ordinary moment carried a new meaning because neither of us was pretending anymore. When Logan reached for my hand as we crossed a busy street, neither of us hesitated. There were no curious relatives watching us, no imaginary relationship to protect, and no reason to explain the simple gesture. He held my hand because he wanted to, and I realized I had wanted the same thing for much longer than I had admitted to myself. We spent hours wandering through the weekend farmers market, tasting homemade pastries, laughing at handcrafted decorations we both knew we would never buy, and stopping at every bookstore we passed. At one small shop, Logan disappeared behind a shelf before returning with a familiar novel in his hands. "Remember this?" he asked. I laughed immediately. "You borrowed that from me in college." "I know." He turned the book over before smiling sheepishly. "I accidentally kept it." "Accidentally?" "Fine," he admitted. "I liked that every time I looked at it. I remembered you recommending it." I shook my head with an amused smile. "You could have just asked to keep it." "I probably should have." His answer sounded as though it applied to much more than a borrowed book. Later we found ourselves sitting beside the river with 2 cups of coffee, watching small boats drift peacefully across the water. Logan looked unusually thoughtful. "Can I confess something else?" he asked. "You seem to be making a habit of that." He laughed softly. "The day we first met, I noticed your shoelace was untied before orientation even started." I looked down instinctively, making him laugh even harder. "See? You still check." "Did you tell me?" "No, why not?" "Because 5 minutes later you tied it yourself." He smiled warmly. "That was the first time I realized you preferred figuring things out on your own before asking for help." I stared at him in complete disbelief. "You remember something that small?" Logan shrugged gently. "I remember a lot of things when they involve you." I smiled without looking away. That might be the sweetest sentence anyone has ever said to me. Before he could answer, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. I opened it and immediately laughed. She had sent us one of the photographs from the engagement party along with a simple caption. "I knew before either of you did." Logan leaned closer to read it before smiling with quiet embarrassment. "Your sister might never let us forget how this started." Maybe she should not. I looked back at the picture. If she had not asked whether I was dating anyone, none of this would have happened. Logan gently shook his head. "I think it would have happened eventually." "Why?" His eyes met mine with calm certainty. "Because no matter how long we kept calling it friendship, my heart had already made its decision years ago. I felt every remaining doubt quietly disappear. The future no longer felt uncertain or frightening. It simply felt familiar, like another ordinary afternoon beside my best friend, except now we finally had the courage to call him by the title he had unknowingly earned long before either of us found the words to say it. Over the next several weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt both wonderfully familiar and completely new. Logan and I still met for coffee every Saturday morning, still argued over which movies deserved another rewatch, and still texted each other about the smallest details of our day. The difference was that we no longer hid the affection that had quietly existed beneath every conversation. Simple moments became easier instead of more complicated. Holding hands while walking through downtown no longer required an excuse. Waiting for each other after work felt natural because we both wanted to end our day together. Somehow our relationship never replaced our friendship. It simply gave a name to everything we had already built over the years. One Sunday evening, Rachel invited us to dinner exactly as she had promised at the engagement party. As Logan parked outside her house, he looked over with an amused smile. "Ready for another round of questions?" I laughed. "Probably not." He reached over and squeezed my hand gently. We survived the first time. Inside, the house smelled like homemade pasta and fresh bread. Rachel greeted us with the same bright smile she had worn the night everything changed. "They are my favorite people." She hugged both of us before leading us toward the dining room where the rest of the family had already gathered. Dinner quickly turned into laughter, stories, and playful teasing. My grandfather smiled across the table before saying, "You two seem even happier now than you did at the engagement party." Logan and I exchanged an amused glance. "That is because we are finally telling the truth," I answered. The room became surprisingly quiet for a second before Rachel gently rested her fork on her plate. I had a feeling. I blinked. "You knew?" She smiled knowingly. "Not everything, but I have watched the two of you for years." Logan laughed nervously. "Was it that obvious?" Rachel nodded. "You always noticed each other before anyone else in the room. Tyler always looked for you whenever something funny happened. Logan always made sure Tyler never faced a difficult moment alone. Nobody acts that consistently unless the relationship already means something special." My mother smiled warmly. "We just assumed you would figure it out eventually." I looked around the table in complete surprise. Everyone knew except us. My father chuckled. "Sometimes the people inside the story are the last ones to recognize what everyone else can already see." The entire table laughed, including Logan, who looked both embarrassed and relieved at the same time. After dinner, Rachel asked us to help bring dessert into the backyard. As we carried plates beneath glowing patio lights, she quietly slowed her pace until only the three of us remained near the garden. "I owe both of you something," she said softly. Logan looked confused. "For what?" "For trusting me enough to keep showing up." She smiled gently at both of us. That night at the engagement party started with an unexpected surprise, but what makes me happiest is knowing you did not let fear send you back to pretending. I looked toward Logan before answering. "Neither of us wants to pretend anymore." Rachel nodded with obvious satisfaction. "Good." She handed each of us a slice of pie before walking back toward the others, leaving us standing beneath the quiet evening sky. Logan looked around the peaceful backyard before smiling at me. "You know something?" "What?" "The funniest part of this entire story is that we spent years worrying about what everyone would think." I smiled as warm lights reflected across the garden. "And it turns out the people who loved us were simply waiting for us to catch up." Logan laughed softly before reaching for my hand once again. This time there was no performance, no careful explanation, and no invisible lines separating friendship from something deeper. There were only two people who had finally stopped running from the truth, surrounded by family who welcomed that truth with open hearts, proving that the happiest endings sometimes begin not with a perfect plan, but with the courage to stop pretending and simply live honestly beside the person who had quietly felt like home all along. Nearly a year later, Rachel celebrated her first wedding anniversary with a backyard gathering at the same house, where everyone had once believed a carefully invented story. This time there were no misunderstandings waiting around the corner, no secret rules to follow, and no imaginary relationship to protect. Logan and I arrived together carrying homemade dessert, laughing because he had insisted on decorating the cake himself, even though neither of us had any real talent for it. Rachel welcomed us with the same bright smile she always had, but this time she looked at us with quiet satisfaction instead of curious surprise. "You two finally look exactly the way I always imagined," she said before pulling us both into a hug. Throughout the afternoon, family members drifted between conversations, children played across the lawn, and music floated softly through the warm summer air. At one point, my grandfather asked Logan to help him move several folding chairs into the shade while I stayed behind talking with my mother. She smiled as she watched Logan patiently helping everyone who asked. "He has always done that," she said, "even before either of you realized what was happening." I followed Logan with my eyes as he laughed with my grandfather over something I could not hear. "I know," I answered quietly. "I just needed longer than everyone else to understand why." My mother gently squeezed my shoulder. "Sometimes the best things grow so naturally that you forget they have been growing at all." Later that evening, after dinner had ended and the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees, Logan and I slipped away from the crowd for a short walk through the quiet neighborhood. The streets looked peaceful beneath rows of glowing porch lights, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the warm air. We eventually found ourselves sitting on a familiar park bench not far from the small coffee shop, where everything had truly changed. Logan leaned back comfortably before smiling toward the evening sky. "Can I admit something embarrassing?" he asked. I laughed. "You have earned that privilege." He reached into his wallet and carefully unfolded a slightly worn photograph. It was the picture Rachel had taken during the engagement party, the one where we had been looking at each other instead of the camera, while everyone believed we were pretending. You still carry that? I asked with a surprised smile. Logan nodded. Every day. I looked at the photograph again. Back then I thought this picture captured the biggest lie we had ever told. Logan gently shook his head. I think it captured the moment we finally stopped lying to ourselves. I smiled because I knew he was right. The fake relationship had never created our feelings. It had simply revealed years of quiet loyalty, shared routines, unspoken care, and a friendship so strong that love had already been living inside it without either of us recognizing its name. I carefully folded the photograph and handed it back. You should keep it. Logan smiled warmly before placing it safely inside his wallet once more. I plan to. We stood together and slowly began walking back toward Rachel's house, where laughter still floated through the evening air. Before reaching the gate, Logan reached for my hand exactly the same way he had done countless times over the past year. This time there was no hesitation from either of us because the gesture no longer needed an explanation. I looked at him and quietly laughed. You know, if someone had told me that one impossible evening would completely change my life, I never would have believed them. Logan smiled with the same calm warmth that had first carried me through the hardest night of my life. Maybe, he said gently, but the truth is that nothing really changed that night. We simply stopped pretending we could live without the person who had already become our home. We walked through the garden gate together as family called our names from across the yard, and surrounded by the people who had supported us all along. I realized the happiest ending was never about convincing the world that we belonged together. It was about finally believing it ourselves.